not every family is a home, and Daniel Carter learned that the hard way. Ever since he was a child, he's always known he was different. No matter how hard he tried, he was never seen in the same light as his younger brother Ethan, the perfect son, the pride of the family. But Daniel got used to it. He learned to accept his place on the sidelines until Ethan's wedding day. What was supposed to be a family celebration became the stage for his ultimate humiliation. Isolated from the guests, ignored by his parents, treated like a stranger in his own blood. But this time Daniel didn't stay silent. What he did next left everyone speechless and shattered the perfect image his family had spent years building. But what really happened that night? And why did Ethan's fiancée come to him days later? Stay tuned in to find out the truth behind the wedding that turned into a disaster, and the twist no one saw coming. I'd love to hear where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying this, let me know in the comments and make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely won't want to miss. Daniel Carter sat in his modest apartment, surrounded by the familiar chaos of books and papers that seemed to reflect the clutter in his mind. A bachelor's degree in hand, he had poured himself into his studies seeking solace in the pursuit of knowledge rather than family validation. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the sun streamed through the window, casting warm beams on the worn wooden floor. As he absent-mindedly scrolled through his social media feed, a post caught his eye. A photo of his younger brother Ethan, grinning widely, standing beside a radiant woman in a stunning white dress. The caption read, "Excited to announce our engagement. Can't wait to start this next chapter with the love of my life." The words blurred as Daniel fought a surge of emotions. He had hoped to hear the news directly from his family, perhaps a phone call or a casual mention during a family dinner. Instead, he felt like a ghost haunting the edges of their lives. His heart sank as he read the comments flooding in, filled with excitement and congratulations. "Perfect couple. So happy for you both. You're going to be an amazing husband, Ethan." Each message felt like a dagger, a reminder of his own invisibility in the family tapestry. "Why am I even surprised?" Daniel muttered to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. The familiar sense of exclusion washed over him like a cold wave. Ever since they were children, he had been the shadow to Ethan's light. While Ethan thrived in their parents' adoration, Daniel learned to navigate life in the periphery, finding his worth in achievements rather than familial love. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from his mother. "Just wanted to let you know that Ethan is getting married. We hope you can make it to the wedding. Love you." The casual tone felt like a slap in the face, a reminder that he was merely an obligation, a distant relative expected to show up for the sake of appearances. Daniel stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard as he contemplated a response. But what was there to say that he felt like an unwelcome guest in his own family? Instead, he put the phone down, letting out a frustrated sigh. He had long ago accepted his role as the unwanted son, the one who didn't fit the mold. But this felt different. It was the final nail in the coffin of his hope for acceptance. With a heavy heart, he decided he would attend the wedding. Not because he wanted to, but because he knew that declining the invitation would only cement the narrative that he was the ungrateful son, the brother who couldn't be bothered to show up. He would be painted as the villain in their story. "I'll go," he muttered to himself, "and I'll endure it like I always do." As the wedding day approached, Daniel found himself in a flurry of emotions. He couldn't shake off the sense of dread that clung to him like a second skin. Days later, he arrived at the opulent hotel where the wedding festivities were set to unfold. The grandeur of the place was overwhelming with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers that sparkled like stars. He stepped out of the elevator onto the floor where the celebrations were taking place, immediately feeling the weight of unwelcoming eyes upon him. "Daniel!" a voice boomed from across the lobby. He turned to see a family friend, Mr. Jenkins, approaching with a surprised expression. "I didn't expect to see you here. Ethan's wedding, huh? Seems like everyone is in high spirits." His tone was jovial, but Daniel could sense the underlying awkwardness. It was as if Mr. Jenkins had stumbled upon a relic long forgotten. Daniel, the brother who never quite fit in. "Yeah, just thought I'd drop by," Daniel replied, forcing a smile. He could feel the tension in his stomach tightening. "How have you been?" "Busy as always. But I see Ethan is doing well." "You must be proud of him." The well-meaning comment stung and Daniel's smile faltered. "Sure, yeah," he said, not wanting to delve into the complexities of his feelings. "Well, enjoy the festivities," Mr. Jenkins said, patting his back too hard as if trying to reassure both of them that everything was fine. Daniel nodded, watching the man walk away, leaving him once again in the shadows. That evening, during the rehearsal dinner, Daniel felt like a ghost at a gathering of the living. He took his seat at the long table, trying to blend into the background. The laughter and chatter around him echoed like a distant storm, each wave crashing against the walls he had built. He attempted to engage in conversation with his parents, but they were too engrossed in discussing Ethan's plans for the future, their voices rising in excitement. "Did you see the way Ethan handled the venue so organized?" his mother exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with pride. "Yeah, he really has a knack for this," his father added, nodding in agreement. Daniel sat in silence, pushing his food around on his plate, feeling the familiar sting of exclusion. He caught a glimpse of Ethan across the table, animatedly telling a story, the center of attention. This was the role Daniel had always wanted to play but never could. Halfway through the dinner, Richard Donovan, Olivia's father, stood up to give a toast. He raised his glass, his deep voice commanding the room's attention. "To Ethan and Olivia, the perfect couple, may your love be as strong as the bonds of family." As the guests raised their glasses in unison, Daniel felt another wave of isolation wash over him. He was merely a spectator, an observer to a family he felt increasingly distant from. Later, as the night wound down, Daniel slipped away to find a quiet corner. He needed a moment to breathe, to collect his thoughts. The walls felt as if they were closing in, the laughter of his family echoing in his ears. Why did he keep putting himself through this? Suddenly, he noticed a piece of paper lying on the table. Curious, he picked it up and realized it was the seating chart for the wedding. As he scanned the names, his stomach dropped. His seat was at a table isolated near the entrance, far from the main festivities. It was a clear message: he was not meant to be part of the family celebration, just an obligatory presence to avoid the appearance of conflict. Daniel's heart raced as he felt anger bubbling within him. This was not an oversight, it was a deliberate choice. He could feel the weight of years of resentment building inside him, years of being treated as an afterthought. Something snapped. He refused to be the invisible man anymore. He took a deep breath, determination flooding his veins. This time, he would not allow himself to be sidelined. He would not leave without making his voice heard, and he would not let this family continue to define him by their narrow perceptions. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, but for Daniel Carter, the day felt heavy with unspoken tension. He sat on the edge of the bed in his hotel room, staring at the invitation that had come without a personal touch. Just a glossy card with his brother Ethan's name and the words, "You're invited," printed in elegant font. The irony twisted in his gut. He was not truly invited. He was merely tolerated, a necessary accessory to the day. After a quick shower, he dressed in a suit that he had bought on sale, a stark contrast to the tailored outfits he knew the rest of the family would be wearing. He could almost hear the whispers of their judgment as he walked through the hotel corridors, the clacking of his shoes echoing his inner turmoil. The wedding was set to take place in a lavish ballroom, and as he made his way downstairs, he couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider looking in. Upon arriving in the bustling lobby, he noticed a familiar face. A family friend, Tom, who had been part of Daniel's life since childhood. Tom's eyes widened in surprise when he spotted Daniel. "Daniel! It's been ages, I didn't know you'd be here," he exclaimed, his voice carrying a hint of confusion. "Yeah, just thought I'd show up," Daniel replied, forcing a smile. "You know how it is." Tom seemed to sense the undercurrents of tension. "I hope everything is all right with you and your family," he said cautiously, his eyes searching Daniel's face for clues. "Sure, just peachy," Daniel said, his tone sharp. "Ethan's getting married. What could possibly go wrong?" Tom chuckled nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the atmosphere. "Right. Well, I hope you enjoy the day," he said, backing away slowly, as if sensing that he had inadvertently opened a wound. Daniel watched Tom retreat, a familiar sting of isolation creeping in. He made his way to the banquet hall, where the rehearsal dinner was to be held that evening. As he entered the room buzzed with laughter and chatter, but Daniel felt like he was walking into a different world. The beautifully decorated tables were filled with Ethan's friends and relatives, people who knew and loved him, who were there to celebrate the perfect son. Daniel scanned the room for a familiar face, but all he saw were smiles directed at his brother. Seating arrangements had been carefully orchestrated, and as he glanced at the place cards, his heart sank. There it was, his name positioned near the entrance, far from the warmth of family and friends. It was a clear message he was not part of the celebration, just a guest allowed in by obligation. "Hey, Daniel, you made it!" Ethan's voice boomed from across the room, drawing all eyes toward him. He wore a crisp suit that accentuated his charm, and Daniel could see the pride radiating from their parents as they stood beside him, beaming. "Yeah, couldn't miss it," Daniel replied, forcing himself to sound enthusiastic. As he approached, he felt the chill of exclusion settle around his shoulders like a heavy coat. "Come on, join us," Ethan beckoned, his voice dripping with a feigned warmth. "We were just talking about the honeymoon. You have to hear about the plans." "Sounds great," Daniel said, trying to sound interested, but the words felt hollow. There was a moment of silence as their father, Robert, glanced at Daniel, a hint of irritation flickering in his eyes. It was as if he was silently reminding Daniel to behave, to not ruin this moment for everyone. "Why don't you sit with your mother and me, son?" Robert suggested, his voice stern and unyielding. "We'd love to have you close." Daniel nodded, knowing that he had no choice. He took a seat at the far end of the table where he could observe but not participate. As Ethan regaled everyone with tales of his life, Daniel felt invisible, as if he were merely a shadow hovering at the edges of the room. "And then I told Richard that we'd love to host the reception here. It's going to be fantastic," Ethan continued, blissfully unaware of his brother's discomfort. The guests laughed, and Daniel felt a pang of resentment rise in him. As the evening progressed, the conversations flowed, but Daniel found it increasingly difficult to engage. His parents were engrossed in Ethan's stories, their eyes sparkling with pride, while Daniel's presence seemed to diminish with each passing moment. He attempted to join in on a discussion about wedding venues, but was met with curt responses from his mother, who seemed more interested in critiquing the table settings. "Daniel, dear, would you mind passing the salt?" his mother asked, her tone devoid of warmth. "Sure," he replied, pushing the salt shaker across the table. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was merely a servant in his own family's narrative. After dinner, the atmosphere shifted slightly as Ethan's fiancée Olivia entered the room, glowing in her gorgeous dress that shimmered under the warm lights. She was the center of attention, and Daniel couldn't help but admire how effortlessly she commanded the room. However, he also noticed the slight tremor in her hands, the way her smile faltered momentarily when she caught Daniel's eye. "Daniel, I'm so glad you could make it," Olivia said, her voice warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the chill he felt from his family. "It means a lot to Ethan." "Of course," he replied, forcing a smile. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." As the night wore on and the laughter continued, Daniel felt the heaviness in his chest grow. He watched Ethan and Olivia interact, their chemistry undeniable, yet a nagging thought crept into his mind. Did they even know who he was? Did they understand the sacrifices he had made to be there, to even show up? The next morning, Daniel awoke with a sense of dread settling in his stomach. He dressed carefully, trying to shake off the anxiety that clung to him. As he pulled on his tie, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror, a polished reflection that felt utterly foreign. He looked the part of a dutiful brother, but inside he was a storm of emotions. When he arrived at the wedding venue, he was immediately struck by the opulence of the setting. The ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers, and flowers adorned every table. Guests mingled, laughter echoing in the air, but Daniel felt like a ghost wandering through the festivities. As he walked toward the seating chart, he took a deep breath, bracing himself for the inevitable. There it was, his name carefully placed at the edge of the room, distant and alone. Anger flared in him like a wildfire. This was not just a mistake, it was a deliberate act of exclusion. "Excuse me," he said to a nearby organizer, a woman with a clipboard. "Can you tell me why my seat is here away from everyone else?" Oh, let me check, she replied, her eyes darting nervously. I'm sure it was just a mix-up. A mix-up, Daniel echoed, his voice rising. This is intentional, isn't it? You know it's no accident. I really can't speak to that, she stammered, but I'm sure it's fine. Just enjoy the ceremony. Fine, he scoffed, his frustration boiling over. I'm supposed to enjoy being treated like an unwanted guest. The woman looked taken aback, her face paling. I'm sorry, I'll see what I can do, she said quickly, walking away. Daniel's heart raced, and he felt a surge of determination surge within him. He had spent too long accepting this treatment, this role, as the invisible brother. Today would be different. He would not let this humiliation pass in silence. As he took his seat, he felt the eyes of the family on him, judgment and disdain palpable in their gazes. He steeled himself, knowing that he would not let this day end without making his voice heard. The atmosphere in the grand reception hall was electric, thick with tension. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting a warm glow over the elegantly dressed guests who had gathered to celebrate what was supposed to be a joyous occasion. However, the air felt heavy, weighted down by the unspoken truths that had just been unleashed. Daniel stood to the side, his heart pounding in his chest as he absorbed the chaos that had erupted in the wake of his revelation. Across the room, Richard, Donovan Olivia's father, towered over Ethan, his face a mask of shock and fury. The older man's deep voice cut through the murmurs of astonishment that rippled through the crowd. "How could you betray me like this, Ethan?" he thundered, his anger palpable. "You've made a mockery of everything we stand for." Ethan, caught off guard, stammered as he tried to form a coherent response. "Dad, he began, but Richard's glare silenced him. "Save it, you think you can play both sides. You pretend to be the ideal son-in-law while you laugh at us behind our backs." Richard's voice rose with each word, and the guests shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between the two men. "What kind of man are you?" "Richard, please," Ethan implored, desperation creeping into his voice. "It's not what it looks like. Daniel's just trying to stir up trouble." "Trouble?" Richard scoffed, taking a step closer, his jaw clenched. "Your brother has exposed the truth. You've lied to us all, and for what? To maintain your precious image." Daniel watched the scene unfold, his emotions a turbulent mix of vindication and fear. This was the moment he had orchestrated, yet it felt surreal to witness the fallout. He could see Olivia standing a few feet away, her expression shifting from shock to disbelief, and finally to hurt, as the reality of Ethan's betrayal sank in. "Ethan, is it true?" Olivia asked, her voice trembling. She stepped forward, her eyes wide, searching Ethan's face for reassurance. "Did you really say those things about my father, about our family?" Ethan opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The weight of his lies hung heavily in the air, and he could feel the walls closing in around him. "Olivia, just tell me the truth," she insisted, tears welling in her eyes. "Did you mock my family? Did you think it was all a joke?" Daniel felt a pang of sympathy for her. She was caught in the crossfire of a battle she didn't even know existed. The hurt in her voice was palpable, a raw wound that pierced through the tension, and in that moment he understood that this was not just about him and Ethan. This was about the lives they had all built on a foundation of lies. "Olivia, listen," Ethan finally said, his voice steadier. "I was just trying to fit in with your family. I didn't mean those things." "Didn't mean them," Olivia interrupted, her voice rising. "You didn't mean to say them, or you didn't mean to think them? Because they're obviously part of who you are, Ethan." Richard, still seething, turned his gaze back to his daughter, his expression softening slightly. "Olivia, you don't have to stand by someone who disrespects your family. You deserve better than this." Daniel couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as he observed Ethan's crumbling facade. The brother who had always overshadowed him was now exposed, stripped of the perfect image that had been meticulously crafted over the years. Daniel had finally found his voice, and it had sent ripples through the very foundation of their family's relationships. "Dad, please," Ethan pleaded, desperation creeping into his voice again. "Let's not do this here. We can talk about it later. I'll explain everything. Just give me a chance." Daniel stepped forward, unable to contain himself any longer. "You've had your chances, Ethan. You've been living a lie, and it's time everyone knows the truth about who you really are. You think you can treat people like they're expendable and get away with it? Ethan's face flushed with anger, and he shot Daniel a look filled with hatred. "You're just jealous, Daniel. You've always been jealous of me." "Jealous?" Daniel laughed bitterly. "Jealous of what a life built on deceit. I'd rather be invisible than live in your shadow." The room fell silent as guests exchanged glances, trying to process the confrontation unfolding before them. Daniel felt a rush of adrenaline course through him. He was finally standing up, no longer the overlooked brother, but a man willing to confront the lies that had defined his family for far too long. Ethan took a step closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You've ruined everything. You think you can just come here and expose me and it won't have consequences?" "Consequences," Daniel echoed, disbelief etched on his face. "You think I care about your precious reputation? I care about the truth, Ethan, and you can't hide from it anymore." Richard's voice broke through the tension once more, stern and unyielding. "I won't stand for this betrayal. You're no longer welcome in my family, Ethan. You've disrespected everything we built together." Olivia, tears streaming down her face, turned away from Ethan, unable to bear the weight of the moment any longer. She walked away from him, her heart breaking, as she realized the man she thought she loved was nothing more than a facade. "Olivia, wait," Ethan called after her, but she didn't look back. The sound of her heels clicking against the marble floor echoed in the hall, a haunting reminder of the love that had just crumbled to dust. As Daniel watched the scene unfold, he felt a sense of liberation wash over him. He had taken a stand, and, while it had come at a cost, he could feel the chains of his past beginning to loosen. He had exposed Ethan, yes, but more importantly, he had liberated himself from the weight of family expectations that had suffocated him for so long. "Daniel," Richard Donovan said, turning his attention to him, his expression shifting from anger to something resembling respect. "You've opened my eyes today. I had no idea how much my daughter's fiancé had deceived us all." "Thank you, sir," Daniel replied, his voice steady. "It's time we all start being honest with each other, even if it's uncomfortable." "Maybe it's time for us to reevaluate what family means," Richard said, his tone softer now. "And who we choose to keep close." Daniel nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. The chaos around him might have shattered the illusion of a perfect family, but in its place perhaps there was a chance for something more genuine to emerge. As he glanced back at Ethan, who stood there stunned and isolated, Daniel felt a sense of closure. He was no longer the invisible brother. He was free. The atmosphere in the grand ballroom was thick with tension, the kind that could be cut with a knife. Daniel stood at the edge of the room, watching the chaos unfold before him. Ethan, his brother, was standing at the center, a deer caught in headlights attempting to salvage the remnants of his perfect facade. The guests, once jubilant, were now murmuring, in disbelief, their faces a mix of shock and confusion. Daniel felt a strange sense of satisfaction watching Ethan squirm under the pressure of the truth he had so carefully concealed for years. "Is this true, Ethan?" Olivia's voice rang out, breaking through the cacophony. Her eyes were wide, a mixture of betrayal and heartbreak etched across her face. "Did you really say those things about my father? About our family?" Ethan opened, his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he glanced nervously at Richard Donovan, Olivia's father, whose face had turned a shade of red that Daniel had never seen before. The powerful businessman was seething, fists clenched at his sides. "Ethan, you need to explain yourself." Richard's voice boomed across the room, silencing the whispers. "I have treated you like my own son. How could you disrespect my family like this?" "I didn't mean it like that," Ethan stammered, trying to backtrack. "It was just a joke, I swear. You know how brothers are." Daniel stepped forward, the weight of years of resentment lifting his spirit. "No, Ethan, it wasn't just a joke. You've been mocking them behind their backs, while playing the perfect son in front of everyone. It's time the truth comes out." The eyes of the guests darted between the two brothers, the tension thickening with every passing second. Daniel felt a rush of adrenaline. This was his moment, the culmination of years spent in the shadows. He could finally expose the hypocrisy that had held him captive for so long. "Let's not pretend anymore," Daniel continued, his voice steady. "You've made a mockery of everything this family stands for. You've lied to Olivia, to her father, and to everyone here. You think you can just charm your way through life, but you can't hide from the truth forever. Olivia looked at Daniel, her expression torn. Why didn't you say anything before? She asked, her voice trembling. Why now? Because I was tired of being invisible, Daniel replied, his gaze unwavering. Tired of playing the part of the forgotten brother. I wanted you to see who Ethan really is, not the image he's crafted for you. Richard Donovan's face was a storm of emotions. This is unacceptable, he growled, turning to Ethan. You're not welcome in my house anymore. This engagement is over. Dad, please, Ethan pleaded, desperation creeping into his voice. I can fix this. Just give me a chance to explain. Olivia shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. You've shown me who you really are, Ethan. I can't marry someone I don't know. As the reality of the situation sank in, Daniel felt a strange mixture of relief and regret. He had unleashed chaos, but it was chaos that Ethan had brought upon himself. The guests began to murmur louder, the whispers of scandal and betrayal filling the room as Ethan's carefully constructed world crumbled around him. Daniel took a step back, allowing the spectacle to unfold. Ethan's face was a mask of disbelief as he looked around the room, searching for sympathy that would not come. Richard Donovan turned his back to him, dismissing him as if he were nothing but a ghost. The people who had once adored him now regarded him with contempt. Ethan, you need to leave, Richard said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. You've embarrassed yourself and my family. I don't want to see you again. Wait, Dad, please don't do this, Ethan shouted, his voice rising in panic. You can't just throw me away like this. Daniel's heart ached for the brother he once knew, but he couldn't ignore the years of pain and neglect. You've made your choices, Ethan. Now you have to face the consequences. The room was silent, the weight of Daniel's words hanging heavily in the air. Olivia turned away from Ethan, her shoulders shaking as she fought back her tears. Daniel felt a pang of sympathy for her. She was caught in the middle of a war she hadn't asked for. But her freedom was worth the turmoil. As the chaos began to settle, Daniel turned to leave, his heart racing. He had come to the wedding as a reluctant participant, but he was leaving as a man who had finally claimed his voice. Just as he reached the exit, he heard Ethan's footsteps behind him. Daniel. Ethan's voice was a mix of anger and desperation. You think you've won. You've ruined my life. Daniel paused but didn't turn around. You did that. To yourself, Ethan. You've always played the victim, but it was never about me. It's about you and the lies you've built your life on. You're just jealous. Ethan spat, his voice dripping with venom. You've always been jealous of me. Daniel finally turned to face his brother, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. I'm not jealous, Ethan. I'm free. Free from your shadow, free from the expectations of our family. You've been living a lie, and it's time you faced it. With that, Daniel stepped through the door and into the cool night air. He felt lighter than he had in years, the weight of his family's expectations lifting off his shoulders like a heavy cloak. As he walked to his car, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting another angry message from his parents. Instead, it was a text from Olivia. Thank you for showing me the truth. Daniel's heart swelled. He smiled at the screen, feeling a warmth spread through him. Maybe, he thought, just maybe this was the start of something new. He got into his car, still feeling the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The night was quiet, but his mind was racing with thoughts of freedom and possibility. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. As he drove, away from the chaos he had left behind, Daniel realized that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that he had finally taken a stand for himself. Daniel woke up the following morning feeling an unusual lightness in his chest. The sun streamed through the slits in his blinds, casting stripes of warmth across the room, and for the first time in a long while he didn't feel the weight of someone else's expectations pressing down on him. He stretched lazily, letting the remnants of the previous night's chaos wash over him. The memories of Ethan's humiliation and the stunned silence of the reception danced in his mind, but instead of regret, he felt a surge of liberation. Picking up his phone, he was greeted with a barrage of notifications. His parents' names flashed across the screen. their messages ranging from furious to frantic. He scrolled through them, his thumb pausing over a message from Ethan dripping with venom. "You've ruined everything. You're a jealous coward." Daniel snorted, a half-smile forming on his lips. Jealous of what? A facade. He could hardly take Ethan seriously anymore. Just as he was about to silence his phone, a message from Olivia caught his eye. It was simple yet potent. "Thank you." Daniel's heart raced. He hadn't expected to hear from her again so soon, especially after last night. He stared at the screen, contemplating his response. Finally, he typed back, "You're welcome, I hope you're okay." He hesitated, then added, "If you need to talk, I'm here." Setting the phone down, he wandered to the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee. The aroma filled the air, grounding him in the moment. As he sipped, he pondered the events of the night before, how he had stood there, the weight of years of resentment, pouring out in a single evening. He felt like a new man, free from the shackles of invisibility. The sound of his phone buzzing on the counter broke his reverie. He picked it up, and to his surprise, it was another message from Olivia. "Can we meet?" Daniel's heart raced. He quickly typed, "Absolutely. When and where?" After a few moments, she replied, "How about the cafe on Maple Street around 10? He didn't even think twice. "I'll be there." As he prepared for the meeting, Daniel felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. He dressed, casually opting for a simple blue shirt that brought out his eyes. He wanted to look approachable, yet confident, ready to face whatever conversation awaited him. Arriving at the cafe, he noticed the gentle hum of morning chatter and the smell of freshly baked pastries. He spotted Olivia sitting at a corner table, her head bent over her phone. She looked up as he approached, her eyes widening slightly before settling into a look of relief. "Hey," Daniel greeted, taking a seat across from her. "Hi," she replied, her voice slightly shaky. "Thanks for coming." "Of course." He leaned in slightly, trying to gauge her mood. "How are you holding up after everything?" Olivia sighed, running her fingers through her hair. "Honestly, I'm still processing. Last night was a lot." She paused, her gaze drifting to the window, as if searching for answers in the passing cars. "I feel like my whole life has been a lie." Daniel nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I know that feeling all too well. It's hard to reconcile what you thought was real with what is." She looked back at him, her eyes filled with a mix of vulnerability and determination. "I always thought Ethan was the perfect guy, but now I'm questioning everything about him. How could I not see it before?" "It's easy to get wrapped up in the image someone projects," Daniel said gently, "especially when you want to believe in the fairy tale. But sometimes it takes a jolt to wake you up." "Exactly," she exclaimed, her voice rising slightly. "And you were so brave last night. I can't believe you did that." Daniel shrugged, trying to downplay it. "I just couldn't stand by and let it happen anymore. I've spent years feeling invisible, and I didn't want to feel that way anymore." "I get that, I really do," Olivia said, her eyes locking onto his. "You gave me a chance to see the truth. I can't thank you enough for that." "Just being honest." He took a sip of his coffee, feeling the warmth spread through him. "But you deserve honesty too, especially from the people closest to you. Do you think—" Olivia hesitated, biting her lip. "Do you think I'm making the right choice by questioning everything, by stepping away?" "Absolutely," Daniel replied. "Sometimes you need to strip away the layers to find out who you really are. It's scary but necessary." "Scary doesn't even begin to cover it," she admitted. "I feel like I've been living in a bubble and now it's popped. I don't know what's next." "Take your time," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. Just let things unfold as they will." "Thanks, Daniel." She smiled, her expression softening. "It's refreshing talking to someone who gets it." "I'm here for you. Seriously," he reassured her. "You're not alone in this." Just then, a waitress approached their table, breaking the moment. "Can I get you two anything else?" Daniel waved her off, not wanting to disrupt the flow of conversation. As she walked away, he turned back to Olivia, who was now looking more settled. "Have you thought about what you want to do next?" he asked. "I need to figure out my own life first," she replied, her voice steadier now. "I've spent so long living for everyone else, it's time I start living for me." "Good for you," Daniel encouraged. That's the first step towards true happiness. Do you think your family will ever come around? She asked, concern etching her features. I don't know, he admitted, looking down at his coffee cup. I hope they can see things differently, but I can't control that. What matters is that I'm finally being true to myself. That's a huge step, Olivia said, her admiration evident. You've inspired me, you know. Just being honest, he repeated with a grin mirroring her earlier words. As they continued to talk, the shadows of their respective pasts began to lighten. Daniel realized that he wasn't just helping Olivia in many ways, their conversation was helping him too. It felt good to share his experience and to connect with someone who understood the weight of family expectations and the struggle for authenticity. After a while, the conversation turned lighter as they shared stories about their childhoods, their dreams, and the things that made them happy. Daniel found himself laughing more than he had in months, and he could see Olivia's smile grow brighter. It was a welcome reprieve from the heaviness of the previous night. Eventually, they both knew it was time to part ways. As they stood to leave, Daniel felt a sense of camaraderie and connection with Olivia that he hadn't anticipated. Let's keep in touch, she said, pulling out her phone. I want to hear how you're doing. Definitely, he agreed, exchanging numbers, and I want to hear about your journey too. Olivia smiled, a genuine warmth in her eyes. Thank you for being there for me, Daniel, really. Any time, he replied, feeling a sense of hope swell within him. As they stepped outside, Daniel felt the sun on his face and the weight of the world begin to lift. For the first time in a long while, he embraced the uncertainty of the future. He had begun to forge his own path, and with each step, he felt a little more like himself. Daniel walked through the bustling streets of his city, the sun shining brightly overhead, casting a warm glow on everything around him. It was a new day, a fresh start, and he felt an unexpected lightness in his chest, as if the weight of years of resentment and frustration had finally lifted. He had been through hell in the past few days, but now for the first time he felt a sense of freedom that he had never experienced before. The chaos of the wedding reception still echoed in his mind, but now it was more like a distant thunderstorm, fierce and unsettling yet fading into the background. Daniel could still picture Ethan's face twisted in disbelief and anger as Daniel had exposed the truth, but he also remembered the moment of clarity that followed when Olivia had turned to him, her eyes wide with shock and realization. He had seen the truth dawning on her just as it had on him, and that moment filled him with a sense of purpose. As he strolled past the coffee shops and boutiques, he pulled out his phone and checked his messages. The screen lit up with notifications. His parents were still trying to reach him, their texts a mix of anger, disappointment, and concern. Ethan's messages were even more frantic, filled with accusations and pleas. But it was Olivia's message that caught his attention. Thank you. Simple yet profound. It resonated deep within him, and he couldn't help but smile. He knew that his actions had consequences, and he was prepared to face them. Daniel had spent so long living in the shadows of his brother's perfection, accepting his role as the family outcast. But now he was done with that. He had taken a stand, not just for himself but for Olivia as well. As he continued walking, he felt an urge to reach out to her, to connect and see how she was doing. Finding a quiet bench in a nearby park, Daniel sat down and composed a message. I'm here if you want to talk. I know things are chaotic right now, but you're not alone. He hesitated before hitting send, but the thought of Olivia sitting alone, questioning everything, pushed him to go through with it. The message was sent, and he felt a strange thrill course through him. It was a step into the unknown, a step towards rebuilding something genuine. Minutes felt like hours as he waited for her response, his mind racing with possibilities. What would she say? Would she blame him for the mess that unfolded? He shook his head, trying to dispel the doubt that crept in. No matter what happened, he had to remember that he hadn't forced her to see the truth. He had merely removed the veil, allowing her to make her own choices. Finally, his phone chimed. It was Olivia. Can we meet? The message was short, but the urgency behind it sent a jolt of energy through him. Daniel quickly replied, suggesting a small cafe just a few blocks away. I'll be there in 15 minutes, he wrote, his heart racing in anticipation. As he made his way to the cafe, he couldn't help but replay the events of the wedding in his mind. The way the room had gone silent when he revealed Ethan's lies, the shock on Richard Donovan's face. Each moment felt like a chapter in a story he had long wanted to tell. But now he was no longer a mere spectator in his own life. He had taken control, and that was the most liberating feeling of all. When he arrived at the cafe, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the sweet scent of pastries. He scanned the room and spotted Olivia sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup. She looked up and their eyes met. For a brief moment, everything else faded away. The noise, the people, the chaos of their lives. It was just the two of them. "Hey," he said softly, as he approached, pulling out a chair opposite her. "Thanks for meeting me." "Thanks for everything," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and he could see the remnants of tears on her cheeks. "I didn't know how to process what happened. It was all so sudden." Daniel nodded, understanding all too well the whirlwind of emotions she was experiencing. "I can't imagine how you must feel," he said gently. "But I'm here for you. Whatever you need to talk about, I'm ready to listen." Olivia took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she set her cup down. "I've spent my entire life trying to fit into this perfect mold that everyone expected of me. My parents, Ethan, even his family. And I thought I was happy, but now I don't even recognize myself." She looked down her fingers, tracing the rim of her cup. "You're not alone in feeling that way," Daniel said, leaning forward. "I've felt that pressure my whole life too. It's suffocating, isn't it? But you don't have to keep pretending. You deserve to be happy for who you are, not who others want you to be." Olivia met his gaze, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I can't believe Ethan said all those things," she murmured. "I thought he loved me, loved my family. How could he be so cruel?" "There's a difference between how he presents himself and who he really is," Daniel replied, his voice steady. "I was always invisible in my own family because I didn't fit the image. I thought I was alone, but now I see that we've both been living in someone else's shadow." The weight of their shared experiences hung in the air, uniting them in an understanding that transcended the chaos of their lives. Daniel could feel the connection deepening, and he realized that he wasn't just helping Olivia, she was helping him too. They were both on a journey toward liberation. "I don't know where to go from here," Olivia confessed, her voice cracking. "My whole life feels like a lie, and I don't know how to face my parents or Ethan after everything that happened." Daniel reached out gently, placing his hand over hers. "You take it one step at a time. You don't have to have all the answers right now. What matters is that you start living for yourself, not for anyone else." A small smile tugged at Olivia's lips, and for the first time since their meeting, there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. "I think I want to break free from all of this, Daniel. I want to find out who I really am." "That's the first step," he encouraged. "And I'll be here to support you however you need. Just know that you're not alone anymore." They sat together, their hands intertwined, both feeling a renewed sense of possibility. In that moment, surrounded by the chatter of the cafe and the bustle of life continuing on outside, they began to forge a new path, one built on honesty, connection, and the courage to embrace their true selves. As they talked about their hopes and dreams, the future began to feel less daunting. Daniel felt a surge of optimism, thinking about how far he had come and how much further he could go. He realized that he was no longer just escaping the shadows of his family, he was stepping into the light of his own existence, and he was ready to embrace whatever came next. "I've always wanted to travel," Daniel said, his eyes shining with excitement. "To see the world outside this bubble. What about you? What's something you've always wanted to do?" Olivia paused, her expression thoughtful. "I've always wanted to create art music, something that expresses who I am. But I've never had the courage to pursue it." "Then let's do it together," he suggested, a grin spreading across his face. "Let's make a pact to follow our dreams no matter how wild they seem. Life is too short to be anyone else but ourselves." "Deal," she replied, her smile widening. In that cafe, amidst the noise of the world, Daniel and Olivia began to sketch out a future that was theirs alone, a future free from the confines of expectation, a future where they could rewrite their own stories. And as they shared their aspirations, the burdens of the past began to fade, replaced by the exhilarating promise of new beginnings. The wedding reception hall was draped in opulence, its golden chandeliers sparkling like stars against the twilight sky. Laughter and clinking glasses filled the air, but for Daniel Carter, the atmosphere felt suffocating. He watched from the fringes, seated at a table that was deliberately placed away from the celebratory core of the event. It was a stark reminder of his position in the family, an outsider, a ghost haunting the edges of the festivities that were meant to celebrate his brother Ethan. As he observed the guests mingling, Daniel felt a wave of resentment wash over him. His parents, ever the embodiment of pride, were absorbed in Ethan's triumph, their faces lit with admiration for the perfect son. He glanced at Ethan, who stood at the center of attention, the glow of the spotlight enveloping him. The way their parents looked at him was a sight Daniel had grown accustomed to over the years, but it still stung like the sharpest of blades. "Cheers to the happy couple," came the exuberant voice of Richard Donovan, Olivia's father, a man whose reputation for success and tradition loomed large in the room. The guests echoed the toast glasses raised high, but Daniel felt his own heart sink further. "Don't let it get to you, man," a voice broke through his dark thoughts. It was Tom, an old family friend who had been seated at the same distant table. "You know how weddings are. Everyone gets caught up in the moment." "Caught up? This is more like being forgotten," Daniel replied, bitterness threading through his words. Tom sighed, leaning in closer, his voice low. "You're here, Daniel. That's what counts. Just try to enjoy it." "Enjoy what?" Daniel shot back, his frustration boiling over. "Being treated like an obligation. I didn't even receive a proper invitation." "Yeah, I get it. But you're still part of the family, whether they acknowledge it or not." Tom's attempt at consolation felt hollow to Daniel, each word a reminder of the chasm that separated him from the people he was supposed to call family. As he sat there, the laughter and chatter of the reception faded into a dull hum. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, heavier than the ornate decorations surrounding the hall. He had come here hoping to find some semblance of connection, but instead he felt more isolated than ever. Suddenly, a commotion drew his attention. Richard Donovan had stood up from his seat, a stern expression etched across his face, drawing the eyes of the guests towards him. "Ethan, could you come here for a moment?" Richard's voice rang out with authority, cutting through the cheerful atmosphere like a knife. Ethan, initially caught off guard, offered a hesitant smile before making his way to Richard. Daniel leaned forward, curiosity piqued, wondering what had triggered this abrupt shift in the mood. "Is everything all right?" Olivia asked, her brow furrowed with concern as she watched her father and fiancé. "Just fine, sweetheart," Richard replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I just need to have a word with your brother." Daniel's pulse quickened. He was all too aware of the secrets Ethan had concealed, the bitter truths that lay buried beneath layers of charm and deception. Richard's voice rose above the crowd, but Daniel couldn't make out the words. He could see Ethan's face change from confusion to defensiveness, his hands moving animatedly as he attempted to explain himself. "What's going on?" Tom whispered, leaning closer to Daniel. "I don't know, but I think it's about to get interesting," Daniel replied, his heart racing. Daniel focused on the scene unfolding before him. Richard's face flushed red with anger as he pressed Ethan further. "You've been making a fool of yourself, Ethan. Do you have any idea how your words reflect on this family?" The guests began to murmur, their eyes darting between the unfolding confrontation and the bride, who looked increasingly distressed. Daniel felt a surge of vindication. Perhaps this was the moment he had been waiting for, a chance to expose the truth about Ethan's duplicity. "Dad, I don't know what you're talking about," Ethan stammered, trying to project calmness while his facade crumbled. "I love Olivia, and I would never disrespect her family." "Then why did I hear you making jokes about my daughter's family just last week?" Richard shot back, his voice rising. "You think you can just charm your way through life without consequences?" Daniel's heart raced. This was the opening he had been waiting for. He could not remain a mere spectator any longer. Rising from his chair, he He felt a fire ignite within him, a fierce determination to shatter the illusion that Ethan had crafted for so long. Isn't it funny how you talk about respect, brother? Daniel called out, his voice steady, despite the chaos around him. The guests turned their heads, shock and curiosity washing over their faces. Respect is a two-way street, and you've been driving alone for far too long. Ethan's face paled as he turned to Daniel, eyes wide with disbelief. What are you doing? He hissed, his expression shifting from panic to anger. Daniel pressed on, feeding off the energy in the room. You've hidden behind your perfect image for too long. Everyone here thinks you're the golden child, but let's talk about the real Ethan Carter, the one who mocks our family behind closed doors, who disdains everything you pretend to hold dear. Gasps erupted from the guests, the air thick with tension, as Daniel continued to reveal the truth. You think being the favorite absolves you from accountability? You don't respect Olivia's family, and you certainly don't respect me or our parents. You've been lying to everyone, Ethan, and it's time they knew who you really are. Richard's eyes widened in shock, and Olivia looked torn between confusion and betrayal. The room fell silent, the once celebratory atmosphere shattered as Daniel's words hung heavily in the air. Daniel, stop! Ethan pleaded, desperation lacing his voice. You don't know what you're doing. Actually, I do, Daniel replied, his voice firm. This is the moment I reclaim my voice. For too long I've been the invisible brother, the one who gets overlooked while you bask in the spotlight. No more. The audience was captivated, watching the drama unfold like a live theater performance. Daniel felt empowered, fueled by the years of resentment that had been building inside him. He glanced around, meeting the eyes of the guests who were now witnessing the facade of Ethan crumble before them. Everything you've built is a lie, Ethan, and I won't let you drag Olivia into your deception, Daniel declared, his voice unwavering. You need to face the truth just like the rest of us. As the weight of his words settled in, Daniel felt a rush of freedom wash over him. He had stepped out of the shadows and into his own light, and for the first time he could see the possibility of a future unburdened by the expectations of his family. Ethan's expression twisted into one of fury, and Daniel remained unfazed. You think you can intimidate me? You've done that for too long. But I won't back down. Not anymore. The silence was palpable, broken only by the distant sound of a glass shattering, a metaphor for the destruction of Ethan's carefully crafted world. Daniel stood tall, heart pounding, fully aware he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But in that moment, he felt invincible. Daniel stood in the thrumming heart of the reception hall, his pulse racing as he processed the chaos that had erupted around him. The air was thick with tension, every whispered conversation and shocked gasp punctuating the silence left in the wake of his revelation. He felt a weight lift from his shoulders, yet it was quickly replaced by a different kind of burden, the realization of what he had done. Ethan, once the golden boy, stood frozen amidst the onlookers, his charming facade shattered. Richard Donovan, the formidable father of the bride, was livid, his face a portrait of rage and disbelief. The guests, who had once been clapping and celebrating, were now exchanging horrified glances. Their laughter turned to murmurs of confusion. Daniel felt a thrill of power surge through him, a sensation he had never experienced before. It was intoxicating yet terrifying, and he found himself both excited and fearful of the consequences. Daniel, Ethan's voice cut through the din, raw and desperate. What the hell did you just do? The accusation hung in the air, heavy and electric. Daniel turned to face his brother, who had finally regained his composure, anger radiating off him like heat from a fire. You think this is funny? You think you can just ruin my life because you're bitter? Daniel met Ethan's eyes, the familiar mix of frustration and anger bubbling to the surface. Ruin your life? No, Ethan. I just exposed the truth. Ethan scoffed, stepping closer, his voice lowering as he tried to maintain some semblance of control. The truth, you're going to ruin my wedding for your own pathetic need for attention. You're nothing but a jealous failure. Daniel's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. Jealous? You think this is about jealousy? I've spent my whole life watching you be the perfect son while I was left in the shadows. I'm done letting you manipulate everyone, including me. Richard Donovan, still fuming, had moved closer to the brothers, his eyes blazing. This is unacceptable. You've embarrassed my family in front of our closest friends, Daniel. Your actions tonight reflect poorly on your own family as well. Daniel's chest tightened at the mention of his family, but he stood firm. I didn't come here to please anyone. You all made it clear I was unwanted. I just refused to play your game any longer. Richard's face turned a shade darker. You're a disgrace. I will ensure your family feels the repercussions of this. You think you can just waltz in here and destroy everything we've built? Daniel's eyes widened in surprise, but then he felt a sense of vindication. Built on lies and deceit, you all deserve to know who Ethan really is. I just gave you a glimpse behind the curtain. In the background, Olivia stood frozen in shock, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions. The radiant smile she had worn moments before had vanished, replaced by a look of betrayal and confusion. She approached the brothers slowly, her eyes darting between them. Ethan, she said, her voice trembling, is this true? Did you really say those things about my father? Ethan's bravado faltered for a moment, and he stumbled over his words. Olivia, No, she interrupted, her voice rising. Don't try to deny it. I want to know the truth. Daniel watched as Ethan's facade crumbled further under Olivia's piercing gaze. You don't understand, he pleaded, desperation creeping into his tone. I was just trying to fit in. I didn't mean any of it. Olivia shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. You didn't mean any of it. So you've been lying to me this whole time. Richard, still fuming, interjected, Olivia, this is not the time for this. We need to maintain composure. Composure, she echoed, incredulously. You think we can just ignore what's happening, Ethan? How can I trust you after this? How can I trust anything you've ever said? The guests began to murmur, and Daniel felt a sense of clarity wash over him. He had not just exposed Ethan, he had shattered the illusion that had entrapped Olivia as well. Olivia, I'm sorry, Ethan said, his voice breaking. I never meant for you to find out this way. Then how did you mean for me to find out, Ethan? She wiped a tear from her cheek, her expression shifting from shock to determination. Did you think I would just marry you without knowing the truth? Richard stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. Enough of this, we need to leave. This is not how this night is supposed to go. No, Olivia said firmly, shaking her head. I am not leaving until we sort this out. Daniel felt a surge of pride for her courage. She was standing up for herself, something he had never been able to do until tonight. Olivia, you deserve better than this, he said, stepping to her side. You deserve the truth. Daniel, Ethan warned, his voice low and threatening. You're going to regret this. Daniel squared his shoulders, meeting his brother's glare with newfound resolve. I already have, Ethan. I've regretted being the invisible brother for too long. The tension in the air was palpable, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Guests whispered among themselves, their expressions a mix of shock and intrigue. Daniel turned to Richard, who still radiated fury. You can try to silence me, but the truth is out now, and you can't take that back. Richard's jaw clenched, his face a mask of fury and indignation. You're a fool, Daniel. You'll see how I handle this. Maybe it's time you all learned that your actions have consequences, Daniel replied, his voice steady. Ethan's expression twisted with rage. You're ruining everything. You'll pay for this. I might pay, Daniel said, his heart racing, but you'll pay too. You can't keep lying forever, Ethan. The truth always finds a way out. Olivia stepped closer to Daniel, her voice barely a whisper. Thank you for being honest. I needed to hear that. As the chaos continued to unfold, Daniel felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. For the first time in his life he had spoken his truth, and in doing so, he had helped someone else begin to find theirs. The reception hall, once filled with laughter and joy, now buzzed with tension and uncertainty. Daniel glanced at Ethan, whose expression was a mixture of disbelief and anger, and then at Richard, whose authority had been challenged in a way he had never anticipated. Daniel took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle around him. He had stepped into the light, and the shadows of his past were finally beginning to lift. He turned to Olivia, who was still processing the whirlwind of emotions. Whatever happens next, he said softly, know that you're not alone. Olivia nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I'm not sure what I'll do next, but I know I need to think. Thank you for showing me the truth." As the room erupted into a cacophony of voices, Daniel felt a sense of liberation in the chaos. He had broken free from the chains of invisibility, and for the first time he truly felt seen. What would come next was uncertain, but in that moment, Daniel knew he had taken the first step toward reclaiming his life. The atmosphere in the banquet hall was thick with tension, a palpable silence settling over the crowd as Daniel watched the aftermath of his revelation unfold. Richard Donovan stood rigid, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, while Ethan fumbled for words, desperation creeping into his voice. The guests, once buzzing with excitement, now stood frozen, caught between shock and curiosity. "Ethan," Richard said, his voice low but steady, "is this true? Did you say these things about my family?" His gaze was piercing, as if he were trying to bore into Ethan's very soul. The weight of years of expectation and pride hung in the air, and Daniel could almost taste the tension. Ethan, momentarily at a loss, stammered, I didn't mean it like that. It was just jokes, Richard. You know how brothers can be." He forced a laugh, but it fell flat, echoing hollowly in the vast room. The laughter that once accompanied the wedding celebration had evaporated, leaving only the cold reality of the truth hanging over them. "Jokes." Richard's voice rose, the anger bubbling to the surface. "So you mock my family and you call it jokes? I've treated you like my own son, Ethan. You've been nothing but a disgrace." His words cut through the air like a knife, and Daniel felt a strange sense of satisfaction at the sight of Ethan's faltering composure. "Dad, please," Ethan pleaded, his voice rising in pitched desperation, clawing at his throat. "I was just trying to fit in. I never meant to hurt anyone." The facade of the perfect son was crumbling before their eyes, and Daniel felt a surge of vindication wash over him. "Fit in?" Richard scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. "You think mocking my daughter's family is fitting in? You've betrayed our trust, Ethan." He turned to the guests, his voice booming. "This is not the man I thought he was. This is a coward hiding behind a mask of charm." In the corner of the room, Olivia stood frozen, her face pale, as she absorbed the chaos around her. The elegant wedding dress she wore, once a symbol of joy, now felt like a shroud of betrayal. Her eyes darted between Ethan and Daniel, confusion and hurt washing over her features. "Ethan, is this true?" she finally managed, her voice trembling. "Did you really say those things about my family?" Ethan's eyes widened, panic rising. "Olivia, I can explain." He stepped toward her, but she took a step back, shaking her head. "No, you don't get to explain away this. All those times you said you loved my family, that you respected our traditions, was that all a lie?" Her voice cracked, and Daniel's heart sank at the sight of her pain. He had wanted to expose Ethan, but he hadn't anticipated the collateral damage this would cause. "I was trying to protect you," Ethan insisted, desperation seeping into his tone. "I didn't want you to see the truth. I thought I could play the part, be the perfect husband for you. But I never meant to hurt you." His voice trembled, revealing the cracks in his carefully curated persona. Richard turned to Olivia, his expression softening slightly. "You deserve better than this, my dear. You deserve someone who respects you and your family." His voice was firm, but there was a hint of concern in his eyes, a father's instinct to protect his daughter. As the murmur of the guests grew louder, Daniel seized the moment to step forward, a newfound confidence surging within him. "Ethan," he said, his voice steady but cold, "you've been playing a role your entire life. You weren't just mocking Richard, you were mocking all of us. You've been a coward, hiding behind your charm and your smile." The words poured out, fueled by years of frustration and pain. "Shut up, Daniel." Ethan shot back, anger flashing in his eyes. "You don't know anything about me." "Do I not?" Daniel countered, crossing his arms. "You've spent your life pretending to be someone you're not, and now when the truth comes out, you want to play the victim." He glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of the guests who were now fully engrossed in the unfolding drama. "This isn't just about you anymore, Ethan. It's about all the lies you've woven, all the ways you've used our family's love as a shield." Ethan's face turned a shade of crimson, a mixture of anger and humiliation. "I can't believe you would do this to me. You've always been jealous." He gestured wildly, his voice rising in pitch. "You think you're so much better than me, don't you?" "Better," Daniel echoed, shaking his head. "No, Ethan, I'm not better. I'm just tired of watching you get away with everything while I've been the invisible brother." His words hung in the air, and he could see the realization dawning on some of the guests' faces. They were beginning to understand the depth of the family dynamics that had been at play for so long. "Enough," Richard thundered, cutting through the noise. "This is a wedding, not a battleground for your sibling rivalry. Ethan, you need to take a long, hard look at yourself. You've hurt people who cared about you for far too long." His voice was a mixture of disappointment and authority, resonating with a weight that silenced the room. "Dad, please," Ethan pleaded, his voice cracking. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone, I just wanted to be happy." But Olivia shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You're not the man I thought you were, Ethan. You've been lying to me, to my family, to yourself." Her voice was pained but resolute. "I can't marry someone who doesn't even know who they are." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as her words sank in. Daniel felt a mix of triumph and sympathy. He hadn't wanted this for Olivia, but he also understood her need for truth. It was the same truth he had fought for all his life. As Ethan stood there, isolated and exposed, Daniel watched the facade of the perfect son and brother crack further. The weight of his lies was finally crashing down upon him, and for the first time Daniel felt a flicker of empathy for the brother he had resented for so long. "I didn't want this," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "I just wanted to keep everyone happy." The tears began to flow, and he turned away from Olivia, from Richard, from the guests, as if he were trying to escape his own reality. "Ethan, no one can be happy living a lie," Daniel said, his voice softer now. "You need to confront who you really are, and not just the version you've been pretending to be." "Shut up, Daniel," Ethan shouted again, but the fire behind his words was gone. He was a man cornered, and the realization of his own failures loomed large. With a heavy heart, Daniel turned away, knowing that this moment would haunt them all. The wedding had devolved into chaos, but perhaps, just perhaps, it was the chaos needed to shatter the illusions that had held them captive for so long. As guests began to murmur and shift uncomfortably, Daniel felt the weight of many eyes upon him. He realized he had stepped into uncharted territory, not just for himself, but for his family. There was no turning back now. The truth had been laid bare, and he could only hope that in the rubble of this shattered facade, they might find a way to rebuild. The tension in the reception hall was palpable, an almost electric charge that hung in the air like the thick humidity before a storm. Daniel stood at the edge of the crowd, feeling both an outsider and a silent observer to the chaos he had unleashed. The guests, a mix of family, friends, and distant relatives, were in shock, their whispers rising into a crescendo of disbelief as Richard Donovan confronted his son-in-law. Richard's face was a canvas of rage, his normally composed demeanor shattered. "Ethan, how could you?" he exclaimed, his voice booming across the room as he pushed through the throng of guests. The crisp lines of his tailored suit seemed to ripple with the force of his anger. "I trusted you. I welcomed you into my family. And this is how you repay me." Ethan, caught off guard, stammered, eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. "Dad, don't you dare try to explain yourself." Richard cut him off, his voice rising further. "You think I wouldn't know what you've been saying? You think I wouldn't have heard the things you said about me, about my family?" His fists clenched, and Daniel could see the muscle in Richard's jaw tighten. "You've made a fool of yourself and of us all." Olivia stood frozen, her radiant smile from earlier replaced by a look of horror. She turned her gaze between her father and her fiancé, the two men who had been her pillars of support suddenly at odds. "Ethan, is this true?" she asked, her voice trembling as she stepped forward. "Did you really say those things? Do you really think that about my family?" Ethan's face turned a shade of crimson, the weight of the truth crashing down on him. Olivia, it's not what you think. I was just joking. I didn't mean it," he pleaded, desperation lacing his words. "You know how families are, right? It's all just banter." "Banter?" Olivia's voice rose, slicing through the murmur of the crowd. "You think that's acceptable, making fun of my father and his hard work? You've been pretending to be something you're not, Ethan. I deserve to know who you really are." Richard stepped closer, his presence commanding. "You don't get to play the victim here," he warned, his eyes narrowing at Ethan. "You've brought this on yourself. You've humiliated my family." Daniel watched as the facade Ethan had, so carefully crafted, began to crumble. The guests shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the unfolding drama and the remaining snacks on the tables, as if unsure whether to intervene or simply watch the spectacle unfold. He could feel the heat radiating off Ethan, the shame and anger blending into a toxic cocktail that was now spilling over. "You don't understand, Dad. I was trying to fit in. I wanted to be the kind of son you'd be proud of." Ethan's voice cracked, revealing a hint of vulnerability that had always been hidden behind his bravado. "Proud," Richard scoffed, his disdain palpable. "You think I'd be proud of a son who hides behind lies, a son who disrespects the very people who took him in?" He took a step back, shaking his head in disbelief. "Your mother and I did everything for you, and this is how you repay us." The words cut deep, and for a moment, Ethan's bravado faltered. He glanced at Daniel, his expression shifting from angry defiance to a plea for understanding. "You don't get it, Daniel. You don't know what it's like to have to live up to their expectations." He spat, his voice low but laced with venom. Daniel felt a rush of conflicting emotions. He had spent years trying to be seen, to be acknowledged, and now, here was Ethan, the golden child, buckling under the weight of his own lies. "Maybe if you'd been honest, you wouldn't be in this position." Daniel shot back, his voice steady. "You chose to play a part instead of just being yourself." "Enough," Richard thundered, his face flushed. "You think this is a joke? You think this is entertainment?" He turned to the assembled guests, his voice booming. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this disgraceful display. I had hoped for a joyous occasion, but instead we are witnessing the downfall of a man who has lost his way." The murmurs grew louder, a ripple of discontent vibrating through the crowd. Olivia's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Ethan, her heart breaking for the man she thought she knew. "How could you do this to me?" she whispered, the hurt evident in her voice. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He was cornered, trapped by the very lies he had spun. "Olivia, please, I love you," he finally managed, desperation creeping into his tone. "You have to believe me." "Love," she echoed, incredulous. "Is this what love looks like, hiding who you really are? You've made a mockery of our relationship." Richard stepped back, his face growing pale as the weight of Olivia's words sank in. The realization that the son he had endorsed was not the man he thought he was sent a ripple of shame through the elder Donovan. "I can't defend you anymore, Ethan. You've lost my trust," he said, his voice quieter, but no less impactful. Daniel stood watching as the room filled with the sound of Olivia's stifled sobs. It was a moment of reckoning, not just for Ethan, but for everyone present. The truth that had been lurking beneath the surface was now exposed raw and unfiltered. The family's carefully curated image was crumbling, and Daniel felt a strange sense of vindication wash over him. "Ethan," Daniel said, stepping forward one last time, "you've spent your life pretending to be someone you're not. Maybe it's time to stop hiding and start being real, even if it means losing everything you thought you wanted." Ethan's eyes flashed with anger, but beneath it lay a flicker of fear. "You think you're so much better than me. You're just as much a part of this family's shame," he shot back, but the words lacked conviction. The room was no longer swayed by his charm, and that was a realization that began to sink in. With that, Daniel turned and walked away, leaving Ethan to face the wreckage of his deceit. The sound of Olivia's sobs echoed in his ears, a haunting reminder of the pain that lay beneath the surface of their lives. As he stepped outside, the cool air hit him like a wave, cleansing him of the intensity of the confrontation within. He had never felt so free, so unburdened. The chaos behind him was a testament to his choice to break the cycle of silence and invisibility. The weight of the absence he had felt for so long was beginning to lift, replaced by a sense of purpose and clarity that he had never known before.